Good morning, everyone. I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And for the continuance of Week 2, we're fortunate to have Kate Clark joining us for Wild West Week to share her knowledge of Lewis and Clark. Kate is currently the Director of the Mercer County Historical Society and on the staff at the Garst Museum, the National Annie Oakley Center in Greenville, and found her interest in Lewis and Clark while she was still in middle school and has been studying them ever since. And this morning's session is From the Treaty City to the Western Sea, Lewis and Clark in Greenville, Ohio. In this presentation, Kat will share details about these legendary men, including how they met, their relationship before and during the expedition, and their lifelong friendship. And as a reminder, tomorrow's session, Ottawa County Barn Stories and Painting Demonstration, will take place at the train station at 10:30 a.m., not here at Orchestra Hall. And then on Thursday morning at 10:30, we'll have a historic portrayal of Ponca Chief Standing Bear here in Orchestra Hall. And as always, I do ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Kate Clark.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces from yesterday, some new faces too, and I'm so grateful that y'all come out today to talk with me about Lewis and Clark. So many people have heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but you'd be surprised to know how few people know how they met or even where. So it wasn't until just a few years ago that Ohio actually joined the Lewis and Clark Trail that is run by the National Park Service. And Ohio actually joined the trail officially. A lot of people don't know that either, but Ohio is on the Lewis and Clark Trail now. Unfortunately, Greenville itself is not on the trail, so we're going to talk a little bit why I think it should be, because without Greenville, the Lewis and Clark Trail would not exist. But without further ado, I want to introduce the gentleman to you that we're going to be talking about today. So Meriwether Lewis, he's going to be the first one we talk about, a short biography of him. He was known as a man of courage undaunted. This is actually how Thomas Jefferson described him. Thomas Jefferson they both grew up in the same area, but Meriwether Lewis grew up in the shadow of Monticello. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Meriwether Lewis was born August 18th, 1774 in Albemarle County, Virginia. Modern-day Charlottesville is there, and I did spend some time there. I worked at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello while I attended the University of Virginia. So I did get to see the area that he grew up in at quite a personal level. He was the son of William Lewis and Lucy Meriwether. You might notice that his mother's maiden name is his first name. This was not unusual back then, but it kind of helped keep the family lines straight. That would have been one of the reasons, possibly, that he was given his mother's maiden name as his first name. Some background on his parents. So William Lewis was a veteran of the American Revolution. So sadly, in 1779, when Meriwether Lewis was 5 years old, William Lewis was headed home. He was on furlough, and he was crossing the Rivanna River on his horse when the flood waters took his horse away. His horse drowned, and William Lewis barely made it home, only to die of pneumonia. So Meriwether Lewis lost his father at the age of 5, okay? And it's sad also because his mother continued to suffer quite terribly during the American Revolution, but she was a woman that was also undaunted, just like her son. So there are many stories we have of Lucy Meriwether. She was not the kind of woman that you wanted to trifle with. So for example, at one point during the American Revolution, while her husband was absent, a group of British redcoats actually came, and they were drunk, and they tried to cause problems on the plantation. Well, she chased them away single-handedly with a rifle by herself. Another story we have of Lucy Meriwether is that there was a group of men from the surrounding neighborhood. They all went out to hunt for the day. Well, they came back and they hadn't gotten any deer. They hadn't gotten any game. But as they approached the Lewis plantation, they smelled roasting venison. Well, Lucy had gone out on the front porch and had shot a buck deer from the doorway. And she was cooking it for them for their return. So she was not the kind of woman that needed someone else to survive, which I think explains a lot of who Meriwether Lewis was as a person as well. And I did mention a famous neighbor. So Thomas Jefferson grew up in Shadwell, right there near Charlottesville. And Monticello was not a strange place to the Lewis family. In fact, Meriwether Lewis's mother, Lucy, was known to make sugar-cured hams for Thomas Jefferson's personal table. So the families were well acquainted with each other. And Thomas Jefferson has a story of young Lewis himself. So Thomas Jefferson could always tell when young Meriwether had been past his house, because as Meriwether Lewis would walk during the wintertime, he would leave bloody footprints. You see, young Meriwether Lewis, he had a habit of going out at night in the dead of winter with his coon dogs, and he would go barefoot. And he would go barefoot all night long, and Thomas Jefferson could tell where he had been because of these bloody footprints. From the age of 8, Meriwether Lewis was out at night doing these activities at 8 years old. So it just goes to show he was well known in the community. The family was well known in the community as just being the kind of family that didn't mess around. They were all courageous and undaunted. So in 1780, the family decides to move to Georgia. Now, about 6 months after William Lewis's death, Lucy did remarry. She married another war veteran by the name of John Marks. And John Marks decided that he wanted to move the family to Georgia. So the whole Lewis family goes down to Georgia, and they enter the Broad River Valley, where Meriwether Lewis comes into contact with his first real Native American tribe, the Cherokee. And he was known even from a young age that he was a champion of the people. Okay? But between the ages of 12 and 14, we do know that he returned to Charlottesville. He returned to Virginia because after his father's passing, he inherited the family plantation Locust Hill. So at his coming of age, he would be officially taking that plantation over. So he returned to Virginia to get a formal education. And he was tutored by 3 very well-known tutors at that time. However, at the age of 20, he joined the Virginia militia because he was very ill-suited to being a plantation master. It didn't appeal to him. So he took off, joined the Virginia military, the militia, in order to combat the Whiskey Rebellion. And that's really how his relationship with the military started. But not to be outdone, we have a man as brave as Caesar, William Clark. This was how his brother-in-law, Dr. James O'Fallon, described him. Said that he was a man brave as Caesar. So as you can see, people are already starting to notice that from a very early age, these men are being noticed for their prowess, their wilderness knowledge, and so on, even just where they are living. So William Clark was a little bit older than Meriwether Lewis. He was born August 1st, 1770 in Caroline County, Virginia, but similarly to Lewis, at about the age of 14, his family moved to Kentucky. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But William Clark was the 9th child of John Clark and Anne Rogers. Okay? He was the youngest son, and because of his age, he was actually the only Clark son that did not serve in the American Revolution. But I do want to talk about Anne Rogers briefly for a moment because she has a very similar mothering mentality to Lucy Meriwether. You see, you might have heard the name of George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark was William Clark's older brother by 18 years. Well, perhaps you know about George Rogers, some of the conquests he made during the Revolution. But when he was 16 years old, he actually tricked a neighbor boy out of a very, very expensive pocket knife. Well, when Anne Rogers found out about this, she whooped him until he gave it back. So he wasn't famous yet, but still 16 years old is, back then, pretty old to get a whooping from your mother. But she was a woman who was known for having honorable morals and views, so she trained her boys very well in that aspect. And I have talked a little bit about George Rogers, but much like Thomas Jefferson was a role model for Meriwether Lewis, George Rogers Clark was a role model for William Clark. In fact, they were so close that they were known as twins born 18 years apart. They had very similar facial features. They had a very similar stature, way of speaking, a manner of working with other people politically and militarily. So George Rogers Clark is best known, a short summary of his life. He's best known for the Battle of Vincennes, where he led a group of men through swampy territory to overtake a British fort during the dead of winter. And during the American Revolution, George Rogers Clark was responsible for securing 300,000 square miles just with his group, okay, in the western part of what was then the United States. And that ground that George Rogers secured almost single-handedly would become Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So George Rogers Clark had made a name for himself very well, and throughout his travels, he would come back and he would tell his family stories. Some of the stories that he would talk about were stories of the Ohio River Valley. So, because of George Rogers Clark's stories about the Ohio River Valley, in 1785, the whole Clark family moved there. They moved to what is now Louisville, Kentucky. Right across the river, of course, is Clarksville, Indiana, named after George Rogers Clark. However, they wouldn't get to enjoy Kentucky for very long. Sadly, Christmas Eve, 1798, Anne passed away from something called strep of the skin. And less than 6 months later, John Clark died of a lung infection. So the parents of William Clark never knew that he would become just as famous, perhaps more famous than his brother, but I like to think that perhaps they saw the potential that he had, even though they didn't get to witness it firsthand. So Greenville, the early days. Before I get too far, I do want to introduce my hometown to everybody. So very, very early on, Greenville was making history. So at this time that we know of, it is the largest, well, it was the largest wooden fortification in American history, okay? It had 50 acres of enclosed land. It was truly a monstrous fort. And if you have ever been to Darke County, Ohio, or if you do ever go, I would highly suggest being aware of the trees, okay? When you go to Darke County, Ohio, even today, if you are aware, you will look around and you will notice that there are almost no trees over 200 years old. Why? Because when they were building this fort, it virtually clear-cut the county, okay? What is now Darke County is almost completely clear-cut except for trees that were grown there after the fort was torn down. Because not only were they building the fort, they were building the blockhouses, they were building the houses for officers, for all the enlisted men, and they were burning fires throughout the winter. So even now, Darke County is visually reminiscent of Greenville's fort period. It's still very evident. So Greenville was a link in the chain. It was not the only fort out here, of course. If you look right here, I don't know if you guys can see it, but here's Fort Recovery, Ohio. We are up here in this little area. Here's Fort Defiance. They were built starting in Fort Washington down here. Fort Washington is now Cincinnati. You got Fort Hamilton, which is Hamilton, Ohio. You got Fort Sinclair, which is Eaton. And then Fort Jefferson, where I actually grew up, and Fort Greenville, which is where Lewis and Clark would meet. However, during the building of Fort Greenville, William Clark was already making a name for himself. You see, this was already home to several people that would eventually make history, and of course, William Clark was right there with them. Some famous names that actually made their mark in Greenville were Mad Anthony Wayne. A lot of people refer to him as just Mad Anthony because he was rather fearless in a careless way. We have Tecumseh, Blue Jacket, Little Turtle. The future President William Henry Harrison was actually Anthony Wayne's aide-de-camp when he was stationed in Greenville, his personal secretary. Pikes Peak, Colorado is named after Zebulon Pike, who was also stationed in Greenville at one time. And a name that I want you to remember for later is General James Wilkinson. He is going to play a role later on. A lot of people have never heard of him, but I will tell you now, Benedict Arnold does not compare when we talk about treachery in American history. Benedict Arnold, I like to say, failed at what he was trying to do. He was trying to deliver West Point to the British. He did not succeed. James Wilkinson did succeed, and he was never caught until after his death. So I will go into James Wilkinson's involvement with the Lewis and Clark expedition later on. So remember that name. He was in Greenville with Lewis and Clark. Okay? But as I was saying, during the building of Greenville, William Clark was already making a name for himself. So William Clark, by way of Wilkinson, was running semi-secret reconnaissance missions into Spanish-held territory on Wilkinson's command. So we don't know to this day exactly what William Clark was doing, but he was making runs into Spanish-held territory in what is now the Missouri area and the lower Mississippi River area of the United States. Not only that, but because of these reconnaissance missions, William Clark actually met a lot of Cherokee warriors, a lot of those tribes down there, but the Cherokee specifically, he made a very good impression on. Such a good impression, in fact, that, sorry, I misspoke, not the Cherokee. He did contact the Cherokee, but the Chickasaws he made a lasting impression on, so much so that a group of Chickasaw warriors actually followed him back to Greenville. And not only did they willingly follow him back to Greenville, but these Chickasaw warriors were put under his command. And William Clark's job with these Chickasaw warriors was to scout out the area just north of where Greenville was being built. The reason for this is as Greenville was being built, a lot of the hostile tribes were living right immediately to the north, okay? So it was William Clark's job with these Chickasaw scouts to patrol the northern part of what is now Darke County to ensure that there were no savage frontier type moods coming down from the north. It was something that had happened repeatedly. So that was their hostile war parties were a huge concern. So he was given control of that, and he was seen, his prowess in this area was noted repeatedly by his superiors. So even to the point where William Clark was actually put in charge of a group that is known as the Chosen Rifles. It was a group of 75 men that were hand-chosen based on their ability to use rifles. Okay, they were very, very, very good marksmen. And he was given the command of them. And not only that, but he was actually given the quartermaster, the role of quartermaster for the 4th Sublegion as well. So even before Greenville is completed, William Clark is making a name for himself. And not only did James Wilkinson write about his charisma and his courage and full support of him, but Anthony Wayne did as well. And something that you do want to remember here is that Wayne and Wilkinson absolutely hated each other. They did not get along at all. They had opposing viewpoints, goals in the military, but somehow they both agreed that William Clark was a very, very valuable leader from very early on because of what they saw from him in Greenville. Now, on a little bit of a wider net here, we are going to talk about the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers took place August 20th, 1794, and just to summarize it very briefly, the Northwestern Confederacy of Native Americans fled to Fort Miami, which was a British fort. They lost the battle and they fled to Fort Miami for protection, for solace. Okay, they were trying to escape from the American forces that were following them. Well, the British did not want to start a second revolution. So the British closed the doors and they said they could not help them. This resulted in the end of the Northwest Indian War, unofficially. The following August in 1795, the Treaty of Greenville was signed in Greenville, Ohio, and that did officially end the Northwest Indian War. Now, Lewis and Clark were present for that, and I am going to talk a little bit more about how them witnessing that treaty signing did influence them later on in life. But yeah, the Treaty of Greenville took place there in Greenville in 1795. And I am going to talk about exactly the signing of the Treaty in Greenville, 1795. So you may or may not be familiar with this painting. Okay, it's by Howard Chandler Christie. He's a native of Ohio, and there are a lot of famous people right here in this portrait. Okay, there's the practice copy, as it were, that's hanging in the Garst Museum. We actually have a copy of this hanging in our local hospital in Greenville, and before they refurbished the local Kroger, the mural was on the front door of like the entrance of Kroger too. So everywhere you go in Greenville, you will run into a rendition of this painting. This painting, the original actually that this picture is based off of, is actually hanging in the eastern stairwell of our State House right now. And the reason I know it's hanging there right now is because I went to see it to make sure. And when I went to see it, I actually got a close-up picture. So this is the painting, the signing of the Treaty of Greenville. That right there is Meriwether Lewis. And that right there is William Clark. A lot of people know that Anthony Wayne, they know that William Henry Harrison, they know William Wells. Those people are all in this portrait, this picture. But a lot of people have no idea that, yeah, not only were Lewis and Clark in Greenville, but they are in the signing of the Treaty of Greenville portrait. So I like to point that out to people that don't know. However, while William Clark was enjoying the accolades of his superiors, even as far up as George Washington, I do want to mention that, William Clark got a lieutenant's commission while he was in Greenville, and it's because a list of officers that were up for the position was handed to President George Washington, and George Washington actually picked William Clark's name out of the list to get the promotion. So Wayne and Wilkinson, who both hate each other, both support William Clark's leadership abilities, and even President Washington does too. But then the same cannot be said for Meriwether Lewis. In fact, his career is in jeopardy during his time in Greenville. So on September 24th, 1795, so about a month and a few days, almost 2 months after the treaty, there is a dispute. And as it goes, there is a gentleman named Lieutenant Joseph Elliot. Okay, Lieutenant Joseph Elliot is a favorite of General Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne actually wrote in a letter that he commended Elliot because Elliot puts on a really, really good fireworks show. Enough so that it was written about. So Lieutenant Elliot is a favorite of Wayne, and Elliot goes and he accuses Lewis of entering his house uninvited and challenging Elliot to a duel. Okay? So Elliot is making this accusation, and he says that Ensign Lewis showed behavior unbefitting of an officer. Behavior unbefitting of an officer, and that's a quote too. Well, they decide that they're going to court-martial Lewis because, as it turns out, Lieutenant Elliot is actually his superior officer. That according to Elliot, Lewis is challenging to a duel, which means Lewis would willingly kill his superior officer. Now, dueling in Greenville was a huge problem back then. Men were challenging each other to duels left and right. Emotions were very high being on the frontier, a lot of stress, and if you perceive that your honor is being challenged, of course, that's exactly what you should do, is you should threaten to kill each other. So, on November 6th, 1795, the court-martial ensues with Lieutenant James Elliot. But before the court-martial even starts, Meriwether Lewis makes two choices, okay? He decides that he is going to plead not guilty. And on top of that, he decides that he's going to represent himself. Now, Meriwether Lewis has no experience in a military court, actually no law experience whatsoever. So the fact that he is going to try and represent himself is noteworthy, okay? It's going to take every polite and charismatic bone in his body to get out of this because they actually have it in writing that he wants to duel this man. He actually sent him a note saying that he wants to fight him. So there is paper evidence against Lewis. But not only that, Lewis, when he hears that Elliot has accused him of behavior unbefitting of an officer, Lewis goes ahead and he says, well, if you look at the military code, it doesn't define behavior unbefitting of an officer. Elliot is using circumstantial evidence that's based on his own opinion, you know? So Lewis right away is showing that not only does he know the military code very well, but he is more than capable of representing himself because he knows how to play with words here, okay? And we are going to talk a little bit more about that because we know Elliot's side. Lewis walked into his house and challenged him to a duel. That's what Elliot said happened. But according to Lewis, Lewis went to Elliot's house when there was a party going on. So Elliot was having a party. Lewis goes up and asks to speak to one of the guests. So the man that Lewis had asked to speak with came outside. They go off the side of the building and they're talking. Well, as it would go, Elliot comes out and says, "Hey, like, don't have your disputes on my property. You have to leave. Go away. You're causing a problem." Well, Lewis is affronted by this. Lewis takes this personally and he stomps away, leaves. But about an hour or so later, he comes back and sends a note as well with what is presumed to be his second, okay, that says that he demands satisfaction and that he wants to fight Elliot. So that's Lewis's side of the story, and Lewis tells it like that. He says, yeah, that's what happened, but there are a few things you need to know first. And Lewis says, first off, satisfaction. To demand satisfaction. Here in the 21st century, we all know what that means. We all know that to demand satisfaction means you want to duel someone. And that's what Eliot had said, is that Lewis challenged him to a duel. Well, no, Lewis demanded satisfaction. And satisfaction is very vague of a word, right? It's a very vague word. Lewis says that satisfaction is vague and it could mean anything, and that Eliot is the one who assumed it meant he wanted to duel. On top of that, Lewis points out that Eliot actually has done this multiple times. You see, Eliot has a habit of trying to court-martial men that he just doesn't get along with to teach them a lesson. And see, that's something that really gets General Anthony Wayne's attention, because Anthony Wayne is more of a rough and tumble, forward type. He doesn't enjoy trivial things, I believe is the word. So he does not like that this is brought up. Anthony Wayne realizes very quickly that Lewis is right. Eliot does this like all the time. Eliot has a habit of just court-martialing people for small things, okay? And that's something that Wayne just absolutely despises. He hates going to court and filling out paper and whatnot. So already, Lewis is kind of convincing Wayne, yeah, this is a waste of time. Eliot does this repeatedly, okay? On top of that, Meriwether Lewis says, and you know, satisfaction could mean anything, and honestly, I'm sorry that I used that language. Lewis says that he was naive, that he is sorry that he didn't know that using the language to demand satisfaction, he didn't know that that was so inflammatory. He did not know that it directly meant he wanted to duel someone. Somehow he convinces them. Meriwether Lewis is a gentleman from the Virginia social elite. He definitely knows what it means to demand satisfaction. But somehow Meriwether Lewis convinces the court and apologizes for using such inflammatory language, and somehow they decide to let him off the hook. Lewis then calls in witnesses just to really finish it, and those witnesses say, you know, we've seen Meriwether Lewis drunk, and we don't think he was drunk, because that was another thing that Eliot brought up. He said that Lewis was drunk, showed up to his door, challenged him to a duel. It was just a mess, okay? But the witnesses that Lewis call, they say, you know, if he was drunk, I've seen him drunk before, and he has never conducted himself in a manner that a gentleman wouldn't. He's been a gentleman even when he's in his drink, okay? So, and these witnesses were actually, one of them was actually the second that was supposedly there to support Lewis in the duel. That second says, no, I've seen him drunk. I don't think he was drunk at all. So you can't say that. That's defaming him. You know, we can't have that in court. So in the end, they ended up acquitting him and returning him to his post with honor. But an interesting part of this is right here, what I've got on the screen. This is the original court-martial documents. Until about 10 years ago, these were thought to be lost to history. These were just discovered in the archives of, I believe it's the Pennsylvania Historic Society is where they were discovered. So this was thought to be lost to history. Now, one of the reasons that a lot of historians to this day think that Lewis might have actually been drunk that night is because in the book Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose actually goes into this court-martial and says, yeah, Lewis, he was probably drunk that night. However, Mr. Ambrose did not have access, obviously, to the original court-martial documents that clearly the witnesses state that Lewis was not drunk that night. So later on in life, as historians are studying Lewis and going down the trail of his life, a lot of historians support the fact that, well, perhaps when he died mysteriously in Tennessee, you know, he did have alcohol problems. He had a history of alcohol abuse, right? Well, they get that from Undaunted Courage. They use Undaunted Courage to pursue that avenue of thinking like, oh, he had a history of drinking. But in reality, he probably wasn't drunk, okay? Because now we've got the court-martial papers that say, I don't think he was drunk. So that being said, perhaps he was an alcoholic by the time he died in Tennessee. But he did not have a long history like a lot of historians would say. And that's a very important part of Meriwether Lewis's history that I think should be brought to light, especially following the actual retrieval of these court-martial papers. But The author, Thomas Denisi, he also includes these court-martial transcripts in the beginning of one of his books, Uncovering Meriwether Lewis. And he says that Lewis would have had to be an unworldly fellow to claim that he was naive to what it meant to demand satisfaction, because he most definitely knew what that terminology meant. But a lot of historians believe that it was because of this court-martial that Meriwether Lewis was took from Lieutenant Elliott's command. So as a result of this, they were separated. Anthony Wayne, even though Meriwether Lewis was acquitted with honor, Anthony Wayne knew that they would have to be separated. He wasn't going to have a repeat of this episode. So he actually took Meriwether Lewis and put him under the command of another man who was already running his own show and who was already successful and had the support of not only Wayne himself, but of also Wilkinson and Washington. He put him under the command of William Clark. So Meriwether Lewis joined the Chosen Rifles right following this court-martial, according to most historians, and that is the story that is the most widely accepted, is that is why they were moved into the same group, okay, while they were in Greenville. So they actually only served together for about 6 months, but it goes to show that 6 months actually developed into a long-lasting friendship, one that lasted Lewis's whole lifetime following that time. Oh shoot, I forgot, I actually put it all out for you guys. So yeah, we already went over this. I forgot I added that slide. I apologize, guys. I was just going from memory. Well, there you go. So leaving Greenville. So unfortunately, due to family issues and illness, William Clark actually leaves the Army in 1796. So one of the reasons that William Clark leaves the military is because George Rogers Clark, following his serving in the American Revolution, he was actually never fully paid. A lot of his campaigns he personally funded himself. And then he was promised that he would be paid back following the revolution, but he largely never was, at least not fully and not enough to sustain himself afterward. So he fell into severe debt, even to the point that his parents, being John and Anne Clark, they had to write George Rogers out of their will, because whatever they willed to him would immediately be taken by creditors. So they could not will him really anything substantial. So in order to help combat that, William Clark left the military and he returned to Kentucky. However, Lewis, he stayed in the Army. He gained a lieutenant's commission in 1799 and a captaincy in 1801. However, he was not destined to stay in Greenville for very long, because on February 23rd, 1801, a letter arrives to General James Wilkinson in Greenville. So Wilkinson is Lewis's commander at this time, and that letter is from the newly voted President Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson says that he needs a man who is familiar with the Army and its situation. And he goes on to say that he wants Meriwether Lewis to be transferred to the White House, which is newly being built. Okay, so Lewis becomes Jefferson's private secretary. And this is where the echoes of Greenville begin. So their time in Greenville from here on out will influence almost every single political situation and decision that Lewis and Clark come up against. Okay, separately or together. They're going to be drawing on Greenville for the rest of their lives now. So when Meriwether Lewis gets to Washington, D.C., he is put to work almost immediately. Thomas Jefferson tells him that he has a special assignment, okay? So Jefferson is an anti-federalist, and I could go into federalist versus anti-federalist, but John Adams, the president before, was a very strong and ardent federalist. This means he built up the Army quite a bit. He built up the military exponentially. Well, when Jefferson came into office, he had almost the exact opposite view of the Federalist agenda that John Adams did. And as a result, and I'm summarizing this quite a bit, but as a result, he wanted to cut down the military as quickly and as efficiently as possible, because to an anti-federalist, the military is seen as a threat to the freedom of the public. And that's putting it very, very basically. So Thomas Jefferson's almost first goal when he comes to office is that he wants to cut down that military, and he wants to do it fast, okay? So he actually gets Lewis to do this, okay? So he tells Lewis, hey, I'm going to give you 2 different criteria that I want you to use to cut down our military from there. So Lewis is given these 2 criteria, and he's given a list of officers. Now, the reason that Jefferson chose Lewis for this job is very simple. So because Meriwether Lewis had spent so much time in Greenville and in the surrounding area, the officers that were named on this list, he knew most of them personally, because he had spent time supping with them and traveling with them out on the Ohio frontier. Because of his time in Greenville, he knew each of these men personally, which is why when Thomas Jefferson gave him this list, Meriwether Lewis could classify the men based on these 2 criteria because he knew them. Okay, the first criteria is that Thomas Jefferson wanted Lewis to rank these men based on their ability. Okay, so they were to be ranked first class, respectable, or unfit. Okay? That was the first criteria that Jefferson wanted Lewis to rank these men by. The second one is quite a bit more fun, at least for me. So the second criteria is political alignment. Okay, so for political alignment, Lewis was to write that they were Republican, apathetic, they had no known affiliation, they were opposed to the administration, or the fifth and final one, this man was most violently opposed and active in the administration's vilification. So he would be ranking the men on those 2 qualifications in by writing one of those words beside their name. And by the end of it, Meriwether Lewis delivered this list to the Senate floor. This was March 25th, 1802. And because of Meriwether Lewis's list, over 1/3 of the total officers' corps was eliminated immediately. It is important to keep in mind that Meriwether Lewis was a mere 26 years old, and he has just made a lot of enemies. So right away at the age of 26, Thomas Jefferson is depending on this man because not only did he know him growing up as a child, but Thomas Jefferson knows that Lewis knows the men on this list personally because of his time in Greenville. Okay? But there is more coming, and it is coming quickly. So one of Thomas Jefferson's long-term goals is that he has wanted for decades to send a group out of the known United States, we'll say, up the Missouri River. He wants them to look for all of these stories. He wants validation for the stories that he is hearing coming from the West. Okay, so the Northwest Passage is one thing that is rumored to be in this new territory that Thomas Jefferson has just purchased. So Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana territory right here for 3 cents per acre. 3 cents per acre, he doubled the size of the United States. Now the thing is they don't know what they've just bought. There are all kinds of stories. Like I said, the Northwest Passage has been a dream for years, an all-water route connecting sea to shining sea, so that they could just have cargo ships pass straight through, okay, instead of having to go at this time all the way down around South America. That's a long journey. What if we could find a water route that connected the 2 oceans? So Thomas Jefferson wants a group to go out there and see if this is a real thing. But not just that. There are many wild stories of the West. It is believed that mammoths are still alive out there, that there are mountains of gold, okay? They believe that the Fountain of Youth could be out there somewhere, or in live, active volcanoes, okay? And also there's a story that there are potentially blonde-haired, blue-eyed Native Americans that speak European languages somewhere out here. Someone came back with a story of this. Jefferson wants to know if it's true, okay? So the goal largely is not only to verify these stories, but also to find, is the Northwest Passage real? Okay. Also, he wants Lewis and Clark, well, it becomes Lewis and Clark. He wants this group to document whatever plants and animals they find, and also to develop trade relations with whatever tribes they come across. Okay. But Lewis knows his weaknesses. So I did talk about the mental state of both Lewis and Clark yesterday, and I'll kind of summarize it. Meriwether Lewis is a man who is very self-punishing, okay? He knows his own limitations, and not only does he know his own limitations, he has a habit of magnifying and dwelling on them, for better or for worse, okay? Meriwether Lewis is a leader, true, but it's not his strength. Meriwether Lewis knows that he is a scientist and he is an introvert and that he is prone to bouts of intense anger. Lewis is a hothead. We just talked about his court-martial, okay? Lewis sees these things about himself, and we know that he does because of the journal entries he writes during the expedition. So, Lewis writes on July 17th, 1803, "There's no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing the expedition's dangers and honors with as yourself." Okay? He is writing this letter to his old friend from Greenville, Ohio, William Clark. Now, at this time, it is important to note, William Clark has no plans of ever returning to the military. William Clark does not know that his own fame will ever outreach his older brothers. George Rogers is he's still an American hero, even if he has fallen into hard times. And William Clark has also lost a large portion of his own money just toward fixing George Rogers' problems with debts, creditors. His own political standing has started to fail. William Clark has accepted that he's going to spend his life trying to fix his family's name, and not in the way that this letter is saying he might. However, in the same day, Clark immediately responds with, "My friend, I join you hand and heart," because in this letter, Meriwether Lewis promises that they're going to be equals. Okay, and again, I talked yesterday about why this is such an interesting proposal on Lewis's part, but Clark was his commanding officer. Lewis promises that Clark is going to be his equal, even though Clark has left the military at this time. So when Clark actually agrees to join, Lewis has told him, "We're going to be equals, you're going to get a captain's commission and whatnot, and everything is going to be fine. You were my former commanding officer, so I'm not going to command you." It wouldn't work, that role reversal. However, Congress does not agree with this. Congress decides that they're only going to give William Clark a second lieutenant's commission, which is socially a slap in the face, because Lewis was his subordinate in Greenville, and now their roles are reversed. So actually, Clark considers not going on the expedition. However, Lewis keeps his promise. Lewis says, Congress might not recognize you as my equal, but I do, and the men will never know. And to this day, that we know of, Lewis and Clark never fought, and they never pulled rank. Lewis never pulled rank on Clark, and the men never knew that Clark was never actually a captain recognized by the government. Even when the journals were published upon Lewis and Clark's return, it was known as the Journals of Captains Lewis and Clark. Okay, so Lewis kept that promise, and I talked yesterday about how interesting this is based on their backgrounds and the social status they held. But I won't go too far into it at this time. But if anybody has questions about that, I would gladly answer them afterward. So we're going to talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition itself. And almost every facet of that expedition was heavily influenced by their time in Greenville. But I'm going to break this down into how they spoke to Native Americans piece by piece. So there was a cookie-cutter way that interactions with Native Americans took place throughout the expedition. So when talking to Native American tribes, their first thing they did was an initial greeting. So in a lot of cases, they would sit down for a pipe smoking, okay? Lewis and Clark did point out during these pipe smoking sit-downs that they did know somewhat how to participate because of their time in the Miami Valley. So when they were in Greenville, they witnessed how these pipe ceremonies were conducted. They partook of them, okay? So when they encountered Native tribes out west, they didn't stumble through it, which helped create a certain trust with these tribes right off in the beginning. Another thing that they would have learned how to do in Greenville was how to properly give gifts, okay? So during the Treaty of Greenville, Native Americans were invited to sign the treaty by being sent gifts of wampum, okay, wampum belts. These tribes were sent these gifts, and then when they were heard to have arrived at the forest edge, Anthony Wayne would send soldiers out from the fort to give them gifts at the edge of the woods, okay, to just solidify, hey, we're glad that you're here. We're a really good trade partner. You're welcome. Come in, sign this treaty, work with us. Lewis and Clark saw how successful that was, and as a result, they continued this practice of opening with a pipe smoking ceremony, and then before even talking, they would give gifts back and forth, okay, to open that communication, to show that their intentions were pure. However, one of the most successful means of gift giving, one of the most popular ones, were medals, peace medals specifically. So during the Treaty of Greenville, peace medals detailing the Treaty of Greenville were given out. Now these two medals right here are the ones that were given out during the Lewis and Clark expedition. Okay? On this side, you've got Thomas Jefferson's bust, okay? And then over here, you have peace and friendship with two clasped hands. Now this medal from the Lewis, this is the flip side, obviously, different sides of it, but it came in a few different sizes during the Lewis and Clark expedition. But the idea came from Wayne and Thomas Jefferson. Lewis and Clark saw how successful these were. So this is the one that was actually given out at the Treaty of Greenville, okay? And this one is the same on both sides, so I only drew it the one time. It took forever as it was. But Wayne said, "Peace to you and all your nations, and receives you and them under the protecting wings of her eagle," okay? And Wayne is talking to the tribes as he's giving them this bottom medal here with the eagle on it. And Jefferson, he saw how successful these medals were at Greenville. So in turn, he said that Lewis and Clark were to give these medals out during the expedition as marks of friendship. The key here is, why fix something that works so well, okay? The Native Americans on the Ohio frontier, when they came to sign the treaty, they loved getting these medals. Jefferson saw this, Lewis and Clark saw this, so they did the exact same thing during their own expedition. So we've talked about initial greetings. Now we're going to talk about the actual council speeches that were given by Lewis and Clark during the expedition. So there are two important ways of speaking that Lewis and Clark used, well, two that we're going to talk about, I should say. We're going to talk about these two manners of speaking that Lewis and Clark used specifically when communicating with Native Americans. Right here we have a picture drawn from, I believe that this picture was included in the publication of Sergeant Patrick Gass's journal. I believe that that's where this one came from. I'll have to check that reference. But this is what they would have looked like. The Native Americans would have sat down. Sometimes they would have draped an American flag over them as a means of shade. But largely this is how that would have looked when Lewis and Clark were beginning the council speech. So we're going to talk about the verbiage first. So Meriwether Lewis, right here. Meriwether Lewis saw in Greenville that Wayne was referring to the Native American tribes as the children of a new great nation. Wayne referred to George Washington, who was president at the time, as their new great father, okay? Similarly, Meriwether Lewis referred to Thomas Jefferson as the only great father, because see, now some of these tribes have come in contact with French and British representatives. So Meriwether Lewis, he draws that point. This is the only great father that you need to be worried about, okay? And you are his red children. That's what Meriwether Lewis calls them. He calls them the red children of this only great father. And Meriwether Lewis tells them that absolute obedience will keep them safe. Unquestioning loyalty, just like a father would ask of his children, okay? So family lines and family social works were very, very important, and they made sense to Native American tribes. That's why Anthony Wayne and Meriwether Lewis chose to use this form of speaking, because it was very easy when using this form of speaking to establish a balance of power, okay? If you are absolutely obedient to this new great white father, then he will protect you from all of your enemies. Anthony Wayne used this in Greenville when trying to talk them into signing the treaty, when he was telling them what it was going to be like once they did. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark saw that it was effective, comparing them to a father and children relationship. Using that verbiage was successful. So Meriwether Lewis did it too, okay? Similarly, William Clark referenced the weather. So when they were talking about the weather in Greenville, they used it as a portend for how something was going to turn out. And we actually have a story from this time. So Little Turtle, he was noted to have said to one of his scouts, well, there was a heavy rain before the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and that's how I knew we were going to lose. Okay? That's from Little Turtle, and that's a story that was told later on. But it just goes to show whether it was true or not, it still goes to show that those native tribes used the weather to tell them how something was going to turn out, how an event was going to end. Okay? And Anthony Wayne knew this. Anthony Wayne, whenever the tribes would come into the fort, he would begin the conversation by commenting on the weather. He would say something along the lines of, "The Great Spirit has given us a beautiful day to speak." And he did this on purpose as a means of telling the tribes, hey, it's a beautiful day, so what I'm about to tell you, you should listen and you should take heed, okay? And William Clark, he did this with the Crow people. Specifically, he writes what he said to the Crow people, "The Great Spirit has given a fair and bright day for us to meet together." Lewis and Clark learned that this was a successful means of opening discussion because of their time in Greenville. But more than that, there were also threats, intimidation, and ultimatums presented. Now, this started back way, way before even Greenville. But Lewis and Clark learned how to do it in Greenville. Okay? So in Greenville and on the Lewis and Clark expedition, they followed a certain chain of events. Okay? So they would line the men up, both in Greenville and during the expedition, in full dress uniform or as close as they could get to it. And they would put them in through a drill, marching them back and forth, firing their weapons, mainly just showing off, showing how disciplined they were, okay? They would be put through the drill. They would fire these new weapons that often the Native Americans didn't have access to, or if they did, they were very, very expensive and hard to come by, okay? So it was an intimidation tactic, and not only that, but Anthony Wayne warned the tribes. He said that if the native tribes harassed settlers that were moving into the Ohio frontier, the government would be forced to retaliate. Anthony Wayne presented that ultimatum to every tribe that came to sign the treaty. And not only that, but Meriwether Lewis, he warned the Oto people that if they dared try to stop boats that would follow Lewis and Clark on the river, if they tried to stop those boats, the government would be forced to consume them as the fire consumes the grass of the plains, okay? He could have used different wording with this, but Native Americans, they knew what fire on the plains looked like. He was presenting them with a visual thing they were experienced with. They knew exactly what was going to happen, or at least how bad it was going to be if they went against their new great father, their only great father at this time, okay? In closing, okay, so we're still on Native American interactions, so they have just shown that they're a really good trade partner by giving these gifts, okay? They have communicated that, yes, we know how your traditions work because they've participated in a pipe ceremony. And not only that, but they've used wording in different conversational means of speaking that the native tribes can understand and identify with, even through translation, okay? Referring to them as children to establish that balance of power, and then talking about what was going to happen if they went against the only great father. They used all these means that they learned in Greenville, but let's not forget, on top of that, they really want them to come and visit white civilization, okay? So Lewis and Clark presented the native tribes with invitations back east to see the might of white civilization. And they got this idea from the Treaty of Greenville. Because you see, Little Turtle himself actually went to Philadelphia and met with President Washington, okay? Similarly, there were 3 rounds of Osage chiefs that went to visit Washington, okay? The first round of Osage chiefs was 12. 12 chiefs went at Lewis and Clark's bidding to go and meet with President Jefferson, okay? And then down here, Shahiki Shote and Yellowcorn, his wife Yellowcorn, they both went to Washington. They were of the Mandan, who were very welcoming and friendly to Lewis and Clark. And actually, because Shahiki Shoat and Yellowcorn went to Washington, they did get their portraits done, and as a result, we know some of what their jewelry and their headpieces would have looked like, okay? So because of Lewis and Clark's time in Greenville, they saw, hey, this is a successful means of showing them just how powerful their new father is. So a lot of those tribes, and these are just a few examples, more tribes ended up going and visiting or sending delegations, but it was successful during the Treaty of Greenville, so Lewis and Clark enacted that policy as well. Now I do want to say here at the end of the expedition, so Lewis and Clark discovered 178 new plants for science, 122 new animals for science. They encountered 50 different tribes, and that's not including all of the branches of those tribes either, okay? It was a very scientifically successful expedition. Sadly, it would bring about the end of Native American life as they had known it for millennia, but we know how that story continued to progress over time, sadly. Clark's map, I do enjoy pointing this out because he was largely illiterate, but due to his time in Greenville, being in the military, he became an accomplished surveyor, an accomplished cartographer and engineer. William Clark had no formal education, but because of Greenville, he was in charge of drawing the map for the Lewis and Clark expedition, and as a result, he was able to, just by eyeballing, just by guessing, how far in the next bend in the river was. That's how he was measuring a lot of the time, and by the end of the expedition, his map was only 40 miles off. When you think about the several thousand miles covered by Lewis and Clark, that is significant, okay? That he was only that far off, and that was largely thanks to his time in Greenville. But just because the expedition is over does not mean that the story of Lewis and Clark is over, okay? So I actually had, well, I'll tell you that story in a moment, but Lewis and Clark just continued to get teamed up together throughout their lives, both in Greenville, during the expedition, and then even after the expedition. I'm going to tell you of how Lewis and Clark, as one of my friends used to say, Part 3 got started. So Lewis and Clark, Part 1 is Greenville, Part 2 is the expedition, and then Part 3 actually takes place as a result of the Burr conspiracy. So a lot of people know who this guy is. Aaron Burr, thanks to the Broadway musical Hamilton. A lot of people know who Aaron Burr is. So in 1807, Aaron Burr is actually tried for treason. So as the story goes, Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. So because of that, his political goals were largely done and over with in the East. Aaron Burr knew that his political ladder in the East had just been quite literally shot out from under himself. So seeing no future in the East, Aaron Burr decided to look to the West, and like any normal person, he decided he was going to steal part of the southwestern United States with the help of the Spanish. So he is going to need military backing for this, though. So I won't go too into detail, but you might remember this name from earlier in the presentation, General James Wilkinson. James Wilkinson has been on the payroll of multiple countries, not just the United States, for several years. He has even been on the Spanish payroll for several years. He has the ear of the Spanish in Natchez, the Natchez area of Mississippi. Okay, they control the end of the Mississippi River at this time. So Aaron Burr knows that if he can get the connections going, then he needs Wilkinson to provide the military backing to take this lower part of the United States, okay? Because his goal is he perhaps wants to be an emperor of this new empire that, with Wilkinson's help, he is going to cut off a little piece for himself, okay? Now, keep in mind, it's very important that James Wilkinson was stationed in Greenville, because as the story goes, Aaron Burr and James Wilkinson set up camp on this little island called Blennerhassett Island. Some of you might have been there. It's a beautiful island on the Ohio River down near Parkersburg, West Virginia. The mansion has been rebuilt, but it was actually burnt down following the Burr conspiracy, not too long after anyway. So they set up camp there in preparation to go and enact their goal of stealing part of the United States for themselves. However, they are caught before it can take place. They are both taken and put on trial in Richmond, Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson himself is subpoenaed to appear. However, Thomas Jefferson very rarely does exactly what he is told to do. He is very much an introvert with a mind of his own, so he does not want to go personally. So Meriwether Lewis, who has just returned in 1806 from his triumphant expedition to the west, he shows up to Jefferson. They go over the expedition for a little while, and then Jefferson decides that he's going to send him in his place. Why? Because Jefferson wants Lewis to report back everything that happens at this trial, because Lewis personally knows Wilkinson. Lewis is the perfect guy to go because he served with Wilkinson in Greenville, Ohio, okay? And as a result, he's going to know a little bit, he's going to have a little bit more insight as to what is going on. This is James Wilkinson here. So, as a result of this trial, Aaron Burr puts himself into self-imposed exile. The Blennerhassett family, who owned the island, flee in the dead of night for their lives. And James Wilkinson actually comes out relatively unscathed, okay? Because you see, they decide in court that intending to commit treason is different than actually doing it. So they didn't get to start their plan. If we had perhaps waited a little longer, we would have gotten to see how far they would have gotten. But intending to commit treason is not the same as actually doing it, so everyone is largely acquitted. However, the public is not happy about this, and they start burning effigies of these men nationwide. Okay, the public is not happy, and that's why the Blennerhassetts flee, and Aaron Burr goes into self-imposed exile, and the people don't trust James Wilkinson to be the governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, which Jefferson reflects on this, and he realizes that it was Aaron Burr who talked him into giving Wilkinson this position in the first place. It's not a good look. So Jefferson, in a sense, fires James Wilkinson from his governor position and gives it to the one and only Meriwether Lewis. And that's how Meriwether Lewis became the second governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, okay? His job largely would entail watching Wilkinson's movements, okay? Why? Because again, he knew Wilkinson personally, okay? So Lewis is given this governorship. He is to be stationed in St. Louis, what is now St. Louis, Missouri, a sense that he can watch Wilkinson's every move, because Wilkinson still is operating in that area, okay? But Clark is not to be outdone. So upon returning from the expedition, Clark is actually promoted to a brigadier general of the militia, so he really didn't need to be a captain anyway, because, you know, he definitely outranked any captain in the end. And then he also became the principal U.S. Indian agent. Why is he perfect for this job? Because during William Clark's time in Greenville, remember, he was running missions into Spanish-held territory. He is now in charge of controlling the trade in that area. He is the one that is regulating trade and figuring out land disputes between the Spanish, the new white settlers that are coming in for the American side of this whole political quagmire, and the Native American tribes, which, remember, he led his own band of Chickasaws when he was at Greenville. So there is truly no better man for the job, because he is now regulating trade from the Great Lakes to the southern border of modern Missouri, which he is very, very familiar intimately with the political mess that is this area thanks to his time in Greenville. So actually, Lewis and Clark both actually share a house. William Clark gets freshly married to his first wife, and they all live together. Lewis, Clark, and Julia all lived together in their own house for a little while in St. Louis, Missouri, okay? I can't even imagine being Julia in that house, honestly. I mean, imagine cooking supper for both Lewis and Clark. But anyway, so the Upper Louisiana Territory, this is where they are both living now. This is where they both explored together, and they're largely running the show out there. However, sadly, Meriwether Lewis would die in 1809 at the age of 35 years old, okay? To this day, we do not know if he was assassinated or if he committed suicide. Most historians would agree that he committed suicide based on some of his journal entries and based on some of the accounts we have of him at forts leading right up to the day he died in October, okay? So a lot of historians support that suicide theory. However, I would also point out that James Wilkinson had plenty of reason to have him assassinated, because in fact, the man that Lewis was traveling with at the time, James Neely, was actually on Wilkinson's payroll. So we may never know for sure what exactly happened, but it is an interesting side of things. However, William Clark continued to live on until 1838, and he accomplished even more, still drawing on his experiences from Greenville. Okay, so in the year 1808, he actually negotiated the Treaty of 1808 with the Osage people, and it is almost perfectly based on the Treaty of Greenville. Okay, the Native American tribes were offered a little bit of money for a large amount of land. They were given a display of military might, just like they would have been during the Treaty of Greenville, during those ceremonies. And also, this treaty, unlike the Treaty of Greenville, this treaty did fall apart actually within a week. The Osage people realized very quickly that they had drawn the short end of the stick with this treaty. They did not enjoy it, and they rebelled. But the important part is that this treaty is very clearly modeled after the Treaty of Greenville that William Clark got to see firsthand. And then there's also, William Clark became the territorial governor of Missouri in the year 1813. And during this time, one of his last acts of office was to kind of organize the funeral of the Lakota Sioux chief Black Buffalo. Okay, now he organized this funeral almost exactly down to the military, the different procession that he had out in this territory. He almost had an exact same procession based on the one that took place for Little Turtle's wife in Greenville. Little Turtle had appeared for the Treaty of Greenville, and his wife died. Well, Anthony Wayne provided her with military honors, a gun salute, and he even had his own soldiers be pallbearers for her casket. A similar thing took place for Black Buffalo's funeral. William Clark provided those same honors that he witnessed being given during the Treaty of Greenville. Okay, so it still goes to show that even almost to the end of his tenure in office, he was still drawing on the diplomacy he had learned in Greenville. Okay, so this is the legacy of Lewis and Clark. Okay, so in March 12th of 2019, the Eastern Trail Extension became official. So if you look, this black portion right here is the old recognized National Lewis and Clark Trail. This green part right here going from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania down to St. Louis, that is the new Eastern Trail Extension, okay? That added 1,200 miles to the Lewis and Clark Trail, and it added Ohio onto the Lewis and Clark Trail, okay? So now it spans 4,900 miles and passes through 16 states. But it is important to recognize that this trail that quite literally spans from sea to shining sea would not have existed without Greenville, Ohio. So these are pictures from my own traveling. I took these when I drove the trail by myself in 2019. And it just goes to show, you know, without Greenville, these places would not be protected. They would not have several thousand visitors a year. There are over 40 museums on this trail dedicated to the Lewis and Clark expedition, and actually we just added 2 displays for Lewis and Clark at the Garst Museum in Greenville, Ohio, and I headed the creation of those. So if you are interested in seeing Lewis and Clark's involvement in Greenville, definitely stop by the Garst at some point. We're working on getting Ohio more notable on the Lewis and Clark Trail. So, but thank you everybody for coming today. I appreciate it quite a bit. So if anybody's got questions at this time.
Are those grave markers in St. Louis?
Grave markers.
Of the Lewis and Clark? The graves of Lewis and Clark, you had those monuments.
Okay.
Were they in St. Louis?
No. Well, this one is. This is William Clark's over here. Very good question. It's at the Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis. Now, this one over here is Meriwether Lewis's, and it is about 70 miles south of Nashville, Tennessee, next to a town called Hohenwald. It is where he died, on the Natchez Trace, and I actually visit there once every year. Sure.
So how many languages did these two men speak, given 50 different tribes?
My bad, sorry. Gosh. I know that because of William Clark's lack of a formal education, he had probably picked up some very basic, I would say, French, perhaps some Cherokee from his brother, George Rogers, and probably from the Chickasaw as well, just some very, very basic. We do know that Meriwether Lewis did have a background in Greek and Latin because of his formal education, but they themselves would have used a string of translators to communicate on the expedition. It would have been from English to French, from French in some points, it'd be from French to Hidatsa, from Hidatsa to Shoshone, and then back again each time. And that's one of the longer translation trails just to get horses from one tribe. So Lewis and Clark, they would not have spoken firsthand any of the languages out there. Yeah, they documented them very well, but they didn't speak them. Yeah.
Hitchhiking on that, on your comments, how did they, in the early days, how did they communicate with the Indians who spoke one language and they spoke another?
Mm-hmm. So there's like I said, there's the trail of the chain of communication translation. So they would translate something very roughly all the way down the line, sometimes 5 or 6 people. They had French navigators with them as well that they would translate it, and then those French navigators would try to translate it into a language that they knew, and hopefully there was a connection. It was really a terrible game of telephone because if you mess something up, it could cause a war. But if there was just a total impenetrable language barrier, they did have a almost, not quite, but a universal, to a degree, hand signing. So everyone knew Buffalo. That was one of the biggest ones that I know personally. But they would use hand talking like that to indicate they wanted to trade. If they were looking for the buffalo, if they were looking for a water source or where the best trees were to cut down for canoes, there were signs for that if communication verbally just wasn't going to work.
Two questions, one really simple, the other more speculative. Greenville is named after General Nathaniel Greene, is
Yes.
that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
secondly, this is completely speculative. How would Meriwether Lewis's life have been different if he had a long-term relationship with a woman?
Mm-hmm. It definitely would have given him some stability. So one of the things that we have noticed speculatively about Meriwether Lewis is that he had 2 relationships in his lifetime that were steadying. And when he was apart from these 2 people was when he got into severe trouble, even to the point of peril. William Clark and his mother, Lucy Meriwether Lewis Marks, that is. When he was with those 2 people, they were a steadying force in his life. When he was away from them, quite literally, he was poisoning himself. He was getting shot in a hunting accident. He was falling off of cliffs. He was almost drowning. He was being chased by a grizzly bear. Whenever he was away from those 2 people, he was a loose ship in a storm without an anchor. So I do believe that if he had managed to find a wife as quickly as William Clark did, William Clark, he almost got married. He got married within a year, really. He had the same woman in mind throughout the expedition. He had a goal in mind for when he came back. And I think that if Meriwether Lewis had had a similar inclination or a similar situation, it definitely would have changed the outcome of his life. Yeah, he probably wouldn't have been on the Natchez Trace, certainly. But because William Clark took a different route, he was also headed in the same direction as Lewis, but he took a different route. Perhaps that could be because he was married. We may never know. But I definitely think that having a long-term female relationship would have changed the outcome, for sure.
Raise your hand again for Jennifer.
let's see. During the expedition, when they finally got to the Pacific, they had to make a decision whether they should stay close to the coast and eat fish or go inland to eat, elk and deer. So to make that decision, they put it up for a vote. So do you think it was William Clark that was instrumental in saying, let's make a vote of this? What's your viewpoint on that? Because, that's a big point for Stephen Ambrose. He said this is a sign of democracy that's instinctive in Americans.
Oh, yeah.
But the question is, was it Meriwether Lewis or William Clark?
Right.
How did
how
they
you
come
think
up?
that would have?
Yeah, how do they come up with the idea of everybody gets a vote in this?
Okay, that's very interesting. I would say that Lewis and Clark agreed together that having a vote would be the best option. However, I think that the really interesting part of that is deciding who got to vote. Because York, William Clark's black slave, and Sacagawea, the Native American woman, did have votes that were counted. Okay? It's actually one of the first documented cases where a woman voted in a military matter and a black man voted in a military matter. That's one of the first, if not the first, documented case in American history where that took place. And their votes were counted toward the final building of Fort Clatsop, which makes me think that perhaps Lewis would have probably pushed for York being allowed to vote, just based on what I know about Lewis's attention toward York following the expedition. Lewis sympathized with York quite a bit, at least from what we've heard following the expedition, that William Clark had a deeper relationship with Sacagawea. He was very, very protective and respectful of her. So trying to decide whose idea it was to vote on a broad sense, I think Lewis and Clark would have both wanted to put it toward the men. Let's all vote. But trying to decide who voted, that would have been an interesting part of that because, society-wise, slaves weren't allowed to vote and women didn't own land, so they couldn't vote either back then. But somehow, this is a situation where they both counted. Now, it could be that, on the frontier, societal norms were very gray. And that could have been a factor in that. Societal norms were trumped by survival, okay? But yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that William Clark probably would have presented the idea and Lewis would have supported it, I think. Yeah. Clark was the leader of the men on a more personal level. So I think Clark would have been the one maybe to present it. And then Lewis would have agreed without hesitation, probably. Yeah. That's a good question.
Here we go again. Both of these guys were products of Virginia's honor culture.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And you've talked already about how this played out at Greenville to some extent, or to a large extent. But how did it play out on the expedition, other than Lewis keeping the promise to Clark?
So, do you mean, I guess, how did their past cultural experience influence them?
How did they rely on their honor culture ideas and their leadership of the expedition?
Okay. So in the cultures that they came from, they both came from the Kentucky elite and the Virginia elite. Virginia being Lewis and Kentucky being Clark, and there were very strict societal norms. They could not have expected the Native Americans to adhere to those societal norms, but as they were documenting these Native Americans, they were very obviously biased toward the writings about them. Now, I think that the men that they were commanding, they were definitely rough. Starting out, they ran into multiple problems when it came to disciplinary action before they even left civilization being the frontier area of St. Louis. The men did not come from that elite part of society. So they did run into multiple, the men were threatening to kill the sergeants, the men were getting drunk, they were trying to run away, but it only took a few really perilous situations for the men to really rally together. And unfortunately, there were some disciplinary events that took place where lashes were given. They even had to hunt down a deserter at one point. And the Native American tribes were actually really upset to see that kind of punishment taking place. But that was Lewis and Clark's way of establishing that norm. Perhaps they were more influenced by the military than the society they grew up in. I would say because Virginia polite society is more focused on what it looks like from the outside, you know? Perhaps that's where a lot of how they paraded the men in front of the Native American tribes came from. They wanted to show them how disciplined they were. But at the same time, I think that they used their military experience to really bring about control and order when they were on the frontier. I think the military probably played a bigger role than their history of polite society did, I'd say.
So that one slide you have of the map
Mhm.
of Ohio and the chain of
Link in the chain?
forts.
Yes. It might take a moment.
Yeah. Just towards
But I know which one you're talking about. We're almost there.
Okay.
Here we go. Yes.
Okay, so, being an Ohioan and having Ohio history as a high schooler, of course, we learned about Greenville.
Mhm.
I didn't realize there were all those other ones.
Oh yeah.
So after the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, were they all abandoned then because they weren't necessary to fight against whoever was around?
It's a very good question. So actually, by the early 1800s, even a lot of these stockaded forts were obsolete, and that might not have been directly a result of the Louisiana Purchase. For example, I mean, Fort Jefferson itself was only very active. I mean, it was active for less than, I believe, 4 years. I mean, it was built. Each one was built as almost a depot to build the next one. And then when the next one became important, the one before it just became more of like a supply depot. So they were building them northward, and as they built them, the ones that preceded them became more and more obsolete. So they were still considered the frontier, but expansion was moving at a wildly fast rate. So these places were, by the time of Louisiana, they were still pretty rough areas, but they were no longer the frontier. The frontier had been pressed all the way out into the Missouri area by, just in 10 years or so time. So they were still forts or communities, but they weren't as heavily defended. Any other questions? Oh, down here, maybe? Yeah?
Let's see, since you know so much about Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, it seemed that the only confrontation they had with the Indians was when Meriwether Lewis was separated from William Clark.
No.
No?
Yeah, there were
other ones?
Yeah, there were others.
But
Yeah.
the famous one is when
Yes, with
he
the
was
Blackfeet.
separated from, yes.
Yeah, so
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So there was an incident with the Blackfeet where they were trying to steal some property from Lewis and a few men that were with him. Long story as short as possible, 2 Blackfeet warriors ended up being killed in this altercation. Meriwether Lewis, perhaps not so wisely, I will say, hung one of his peace medals around the neck of one of the deceased warriors so that the tribe, when they came to collect the dead, would know exactly who had killed them. This is probably an evidence of Meriwether Lewis's hot-headedness. Now, that is to say, if William Clark had been with him at the time, would there have been death at all? It is probably unlikely that there would have been a death in that situation, because prior to that, they had had a near catastrophic, and I do mean the expedition would have ended when they met with the Lakota. Okay, so the Lakota stopped them. They actually, when they were trying to converse with the chiefs, some of the warriors grabbed onto the keelboat's rope, and they weren't going to let them leave. And Meriwether Lewis was on the boat at the time, and William Clark was on the land. If their positions had been switched, where Meriwether Lewis was on the land and Clark was on the boat, I do not think it would have ended as peacefully as it did, because as we have come to see, Meriwether Lewis tends to react and push a situation too far. into where it's irrecoverable. But because he was more separated from the Native Americans and William Clark was able to quiet this situation down, the Lakota eventually let go of the boat and they were able to continue going. But it could have been a very different situation, which makes me wonder, perhaps if Clark had been with him during the event with the Blackfeet, I'm wondering if that would have ended quite a bit more differently, because after that, the men that Lewis was with and Lewis himself, they pushed their horses for almost 24 hours straight trying to escape that area because of what had happened. They knew that if they did not get back with the main group, they knew that they were being pursued, most likely, by the Blackfeet because they had just killed 2 of their warriors. They knew that if they did not get out of there as quickly as possible, they would never know what had happened to them. So I do think that having Clark there would have changed that situation significantly, because every other time that something was questionable or potentially perilous, Clark was the one that very, very often calmed the situation down. So yeah. Any other questions?